What would you do if the man who made it clear for years that he did not want you anywhere near him suddenly became the only person who could save your home? Juliet Callahan had 30 days. 30 days to marry a man who once looked at her in a crowded ballroom in Boston and spoke about her as if she were something misplaced. 30 days to stand beside the only man who had ever made her feel small and ask him to put a ring on her finger. 30 days before Callahan House, the land her grandfather built with his bare hands after the war, would pass to a distant cousin who had already begun measuring the drapes. The will was read on a quiet Monday morning in October of 1893. The curtains in the library were half drawn. Dust moved in thin lines of light that slipped through tall windows overlooking the Hudson River. The air smelled faintly of old books and coal smoke, while Juliet sat at the end of the long walnut table with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She had practiced that stillness since she was a girl. It was the kind of stillness that made people think nothing touched you. Across from her, her mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Beside her, Cousin Daniel leaned back in his chair, pretending not to look eager. Mr. Whitaker, the family solicitor, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "To the estate of the late Colonel Henry Callahan," he began, his voice steady and dry, "including Callahan House, the surrounding lands, and all financial holdings under the Callahan Trust, shall pass to Miss Juliet Rose Callahan, provided she fulfills the conditions set forth within this document." The room shifted. Juliet felt her fingers pressed together more tightly. Provided. That word echoed like a gunshot in a canyon. Miss Callahan must, within 30 days of this reading, enter into lawful marriage with Mr. Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ashford. Silence fell so heavy, it felt like snow settling on fresh ground. Juliet did not move Alexander Whitmore, the Duke of Ashford, the man who, 3 winters ago at the Harrington Charity Ball in Boston, had looked at her over the rim of his champagne glass and said to his friend loud enough for her to hear, "Miss Callahan has an impressive talent for appearing where she does not belong." She had been 19 then, is standing near a painting of the harbor, reading the small brass plate beneath it because she loved history and no one else seemed interested. She had not spoken to him. She had not approached him. Yet somehow she had offended him by existing in the same room. She had gone home that night and told herself his opinion meant nothing. She had repeated that sentence every time she saw him after. "That is ridiculous," Cousin Daniel said sharply. Yes, surely the Colonel was not serious. "It is written plainly," Mr. Whitaker replied. "And if she refuses?" Juliet's mother asked softly. "Then the estate transfers to the next male heir." Daniel sat up straighter. Juliet looked at the window. Outside, the river moved in quiet silver lines beneath the gray sky. The trees along the shore had begun to turn. Red and gold leaves clung to branches, holding on. 30 days. "Has the Duke been informed?" she asked, her voice calm. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker said. He has received notice of the condition." "And?" "He has not declined." The words settled into her chest with quiet force. He had not declined, which meant he was considering it. The question rose slowly inside her. Why? Alexander Whitmore did not need her money. His family owned rail lines stretching from New York to Chicago. Ashford Manor in upstate New York was known for its marble halls and endless grounds. He could have chosen any woman in Boston society. Yet he had not refused. The noise in the room grew louder as Daniel began arguing with the solicitor, and her mother wept quietly into her handkerchief. Juliet stood without asking permission. No one stopped her. She walked to the window and placed her hand against the cool glass. The garden below was trimmed with care. Her grandfather had walked those paths every morning with his cane, humming old war songs in a voice that was never quite in tune. But he had been the only person who listened when she spoke about books, the only person who left notes tucked between pages on her bedside table, the only one who looked at her and saw more than a quiet girl in the corner. Why him, grandfather? Why this? She felt Mr. Whitaker approach. "There is a letter," he said quietly, pressing an envelope into her hand. "From the Colonel, to be given only to you." Her name was written across the front in her grandfather's familiar hand. She did not open it there. She carried it upstairs to her bedroom and closed the door behind her. The room felt too large, too empty without his steady presence somewhere in the house. She broke the seal. "My dear Juliet, you will not like this. I know you well enough to say that with confidence, but I have not made this choice lightly. Alexander Whitmore is not the man he allows the world to see. I have watched him since he was a boy. Pride is loud in that family. So is fear. I have seen the cost of both. Years ago, I made a decision that wounded his father deeply. I protected my own interests when I should have trusted our friendship. It is a mistake I have carried every day since. I cannot repair what I broke, but perhaps you can build something better in its place. I do not ask you to love him. I ask you to give him a fair chance." "All my love." Grandfather Juliet read the letter 3 times. Wounded his father. Fear. A fair chance. She sat at the edge of her bed as the afternoon light shifted from pale to gold. Whatever had happened between their families, it ran deeper than gossip and ballroom whispers. Her grandfather had written her into the solution, which meant he trusted her. That evening, she sat at her writing desk and dipped her pen into ink. "Your Grace, I believe we find ourselves in a situation neither of us designed. I propose we meet to discuss the matter plainly. Thursday at 2 o'clock, if it suits you. Or Miss Juliet Callahan." She sealed it before she could reconsider. He arrived on Wednesday, a day early, unannounced. The butler appeared in the library doorway with a careful expression. "The Duke of Ashford is here, miss." Of course he was. Juliet set her book down slowly. "Please show him to the front drawing room." She waited until she was alone before allowing herself one deep breath. Then she smoothed her pale blue gown and walked downstairs. Yet he stood near the fireplace when she entered. Alexander Whitmore was taller than she remembered. Dark hair, neatly parted. A strong jaw that rarely softened. He wore a black coat, tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders. He looked as though the room belonged to him simply because he occupied it. He turned at the sound of her steps. Their eyes met. There it was, that same unreadable look. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Your Grace." She took the chair opposite him. "Gump, you are early." "I was free today." "Of course." She folded her hands in her lap. "Then I will speak plainly. My grandfather's will requires our marriage within 30 days. You have not declined." "No." "May I ask why?" He studied her for a moment before answering. "There are practical reasons." The word landed heavily. "Practical," she repeated. "As in financial." "Among other things." She held his gaze. "I am not asking for a real marriage." His eyebrow lifted slightly. "Oh, I propose a legal arrangement," she continued. "We marry. The estate remains secure. You maintain your affairs. I manage mine. We remain civil in public. In private, we maintain distance." He was silent for several seconds. "You have given this thought," he said. "I had an evening." "And what do you receive beyond your inheritance?" "The inheritance is enough." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Is it?" She ignored that. "And you?" she asked. "What do you gain?" He paused. "Stability," he said at last. "Of a particular kind." She waited for him to explain. He did not. "Then we are agreed," she said quietly. "For now." He stepped toward the door, then stopped. "You mentioned civility in public." "Yes." And in private? She met his eyes without flinching. In private, she said, we are honest. Something shifted in his expression. Very well, he said. As the wedding took place 18 days later in the small stone chapel overlooking the Hudson. There were no flowers beyond what grew naturally along the path. No orchestra, no celebration. Only the quiet murmur of the river below and the autumn wind moving through bare branches. Juliet wore her grandmother's ivory gown. Not because it was romantic, because it fit. Alexander stood at the altar, his back straight, his expression composed. She walked the aisle alone, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, she felt the words settle over her like winter air. His hand touched hers briefly as they turned. Warm. Steady. The carriage ride to Ashford Manor lasted 4 hours. They spoke very little. She watched the countryside pass, rolling fields, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. You are not reading, he said suddenly. She looked up from the book, resting open in her lap. I am. You have not turned the page in half an hour. She closed it gently. What are you thinking about, Your Grace? You, he said, without hesitation. Her pulse shifted. In what regard? In regard to whether you believe this arrangement will remain simple. And will it? His gaze returned to the window. That depends. On what? On us. Ashford Manor rose from the hills at dusk. Stone towers, tall windows catching the last of the light. Oak trees lining the long drive like silent guards. She leaned slightly toward the glass, despite herself. It is impressive, she said. It is cold in winter, he replied. She almost smiled. The carriage stopped. Staff lined the front steps in neat rows. Alexander stepped down first, then offered his hand. Juliet placed her gloved fingers in his. The evening air was sharp and clean. It smelled of pine and distant snow. Welcome to Ashford Manor, Your Grace, the housekeeper said. Juliet looked at the massive doors before her. 30 days. A marriage of convenience. A history she did not fully understand. And a man who had once dismissed her with a careless sentence. She lifted her chin. Thank you, she said, and stepped inside. The first night at Ashford Manor felt longer than the carriage ride that brought her there. Juliet lay awake beneath a heavy quilt, staring at the high ceiling of the east wing bedroom that had been prepared for her, as the fire burned low in the grate. Wind pressed softly against the tall windows. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed. He was in the west wing. The house had been arranged before her arrival. Separate chambers, separate sitting rooms, separate lives joined only by a document and a ring. Practical. That was the word they had chosen. Yet as she stared into the dark, she found herself thinking not of the will or the estate, but of the way his hand had steadied hers in the chapel. Brief, warm, certain. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easily. The third morning brought their first true disagreement. Juliet had chosen to take her breakfast in a smaller morning room overlooking the gardens. A tray of tea and toast rested beside an open book. The light was soft and gray. Frost clung to the edges of the lawn. She had not expected company. At precisely 8 o'clock, Alexander entered without knocking. He paused when he saw her, yet then crossed the room and sat opposite her without a word. She waited. He poured tea into his cup. Steam rose between them. For 11 minutes, neither spoke. It was not an angry silence. It was careful. I have arranged for you to tour the estate grounds this morning, he said at last. She lifted her eyes slowly. Have you? Mr. Barrett will show you the tenant farms and the mill property. It is important the Duchess be seen. She closed her book gently. In the future, Your Grace, you may consider asking rather than arranging. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It is a practical matter, he said. So is courtesy. The air between them changed. He studied her, measuring. Would you like to tour the estate this morning? He said evenly. With Mr. Barrett? A faint smile touched her lips. Yes, thank you. He nodded once and returned to his tea. It was a small shift. Small, but not nothing. The estate was vast. Fields rolled across the hills, like waves frozen in place. Tenant cottages stood in neat rows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Horses grazed in fenced pastures. Mr. Barrett, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with weathered hands and steady eyes, spoke with pride as he walked her through the land. His Grace rotates the crops carefully, he explained. But the South Mill's been unused these past 12 years. Why? Juliet asked. Drainage collapsed. The structure's weak, too costly to fix, and so it sits. She studied the old mill in the distance. Its wooden frame leaned slightly. The water wheel stood still. I would like to see it, she said. Barrett looked surprised, then pleased. Of course, Your Grace. As they approached the structure, she felt something stir inside her. The mill was not useless. It was waiting. That evening, she mentioned it at dinner. The South Mill could be restored, she said calmly. The tenants are eager. Alexander set down his fork. It would require significant expense. Then perhaps we discuss it. It is not urgent. It is land left idle, she replied. His eyes lifted to hers. It is my responsibility. It is ours, she corrected gently. The estate binds us both. Silence settled between them. I am not asking for your money, he said quietly. I know, she answered. I am offering partnership. Something flickered in his expression. Not anger. Something closer to resistance. We will revisit the matter in spring, he said finally. She let it rest there. But she did not forget. Winter deepened. Snow fell across the grounds in soft white sheets. The manor felt older in winter, as though its stone walls remembered seasons long past. On the 11th night, Juliet could not sleep. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and took a candle into the hallway. The house was silent. Moonlight spilled across the grand staircase. A faint glow showed beneath the library door. She hesitated, then pushed it open. Alexander sat on the floor near the fire. His coat was discarded over a chair. His cravat loosened. A glass of whiskey rested beside him. Papers lay scattered across the rug. He looked up when she entered. I could not sleep, she said. Nor I. He did not rise. He did not rearrange himself into the Duke. She crossed the room and sat opposite him on the floor. The firelight softened his features. They sat in silence for a moment. Your father's portrait is in the gallery, she said quietly. He looks like you. His gaze shifted to the flames. I am told that often. Was he a good man? The question hung between them. He was proud, Alexander said slowly, and loyal, and wounded. She waited. He trusted your grandfather, he continued, invested heavily in a venture underwritten by him. When it failed, your grandfather withdrew his support first, protected his own interests, and my father bore the full loss. Juliet felt the weight of that truth. My grandfather wrote to me about it, she said softly. He called it a wound of his own making. Alexander let out a slow breath. My father never believed he regretted it. He did, she said firmly. He carried it. The fire crackled. Alexander leaned back against the chair. And now here we are, he murmured. Yes. Do you believe this marriage repairs it? I believe, she said carefully, that it gives us the chance to choose differently. He looked at her then, truly looked. You are not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone easier to dismiss. She held his gaze. I heard what you said at the Harrington ball. His expression stilled. I know, he replied quietly. You believed I inserted myself where I did not belong. I believed, he corrected, that if I admitted you belonged, I would have to reconsider a great many things. The fire shifted between them. That is a complicated answer, she said. Yes. They sat in silence again. Good night, Alexander, she said as she rose. Juliet. She paused at the door. My name, he said gently, is Alexander. She met his eyes in the dim light. Good night, Alexander. The annual winter ball at Harrington Hall arrived 2 weeks later. The entire county would attend. The newly married Duke and Duchess of Ashford could not avoid it. Juliet dressed carefully in deep green silk. Pearls rested at her throat. Her hair was pinned with simple elegance. When she descended the staircase, Alexander waited below. He watched her approach with a look she did not recognize. Ready? He asked. Yes. He offered his arm. And the ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished floors. Music swelled as they entered. Whispers followed them. She felt it. The scrutiny. The curiosity. Lady Eleanor Prescott approached with a smile too sharp to be sincere. What an unexpected match, she said brightly. We were all so surprised. Juliet's smile did not falter. Life rarely consults the audience before making decisions. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward Alexander. And how are you finding Ashford, my dear? That it requires a certain kind of woman. It requires honesty, Juliet replied evenly, and strength. Alexander turned toward them fully. I consider myself fortunate, he said calmly, that Ashford has both. Eleanor's smile tightened. She excused herself shortly after. Juliet looked at him once they were alone. You did not have to defend me. I know. The music shifted into a waltz. Dance with me, he said. He led her to the center of the floor. His hand rested at her waist. A steady, warm. You were watching me that night at Harrington, she said softly. Yes. Why? Because you were the only person in the room actually reading the plaque beneath the painting. And that frightened you? It unsettled me, he admitted. You saw what others ignored. The waltz carried them in slow circles. I disliked myself for what I said, he added quietly. She felt her breath catch. Then why agree to this marriage? She asked. He met her eyes without flinching. Yeah, because when I saw your name in the will, he said, I did not look for a way out. The music swelled around them. She searched his face. And now? She asked. Now, he said, I am no longer certain this arrangement is simple. The word hung between them. Not simple. The carriage ride home was silent, but it was not distant. It was full. The next morning he was gone at breakfast. Riding, the staff said. She told herself she did not mind. Yet when he returned before noon, a snow clinging to his coat, he came directly to the library. Juliet, he said. Her name, spoken without title, felt different. He crossed the room and stopped before her. I owe you honesty, he said. She closed her book. Yes. My estate has faced financial strain, he admitted. The banks required stability. A marriage to unite our lands strengthened our standing. That is practical, she said quietly. Yes. He inhaled slowly, but I would have found another way if it had been anyone else. Her heart stilled. Why? She whispered. Because you are the woman at the window, he said. And I have spent 3 years regretting that I pretended not to see you. Silence settled like falling snow. She rose slowly. Alexander, she said, my grandfather believed you were capable of being known. His jaw tightened. Being known, he repeated, is not always safe. She stepped closer. Neither is living unseen. He reached for her hand then, deliberate, certain. Their fingers intertwined. The fire burned low. The room felt smaller. 30 days, he murmured. They end soon. Yes. Do you intend to stop counting? She looked at him, and for the first time since the reading of the will, she allowed herself to hope. I do not wish to measure my life in deadlines, she said softly. His hand lifted to her cheek. Warm. Careful. Then we stop, he said. Well, and when he kissed her, it was not practical. It was chosen. The 30th day arrived quietly. There was no trumpet of consequence, no storm to mark the passing of the deadline. The morning rose pale and still over Ashford Manor. Frost traced delicate patterns along the windows. The river beyond the hills lay calm beneath a thin winter sun. Juliet woke before dawn. For a long moment, she lay still beneath the quilt and listened to the house breathe. 30 days ago, she had arrived here as a stranger, a name in a will, a condition to be met. Now she lay in the east wing and knew which stair creaked near the gallery, which servant hummed in the kitchens before breakfast, which hour Alexander preferred to walk the grounds alone. 30 days. The will's demand had been fulfilled. The marriage was legal, the estate secure. The question remained, what were they now? She dressed slowly and went to the library. Alexander was there, standing at the tall windows with his hands clasped behind his back. The morning light traced the line of his shoulders. Papers rested untouched on the desk. He turned when she entered. It is the 30th day, she said quietly. Yes. The condition has been satisfied. Yes. Silence stretched between them. He crossed the room with measured steps, not hurried, not uncertain, deliberate. Is that all this has been to you? He asked softly. A condition. She held his gaze. It began that way. And now? She felt her heartbeat steady inside her chest. Now I am asking what you want. He did not answer at once. He studied her face as though committing it to memory. Then he reached for her hand. I want, he said slowly, to stop pretending this was only practical. The words settled gently between them. I want, he continued, to stop dividing this house into east and west. I want to stop measuring distance as though it protects me. But I want to build something that does not rely on deadlines. Her throat tightened. That is not a practical answer, she said. No, he agreed. It is not. She stepped closer until there was no space between them. Then we must write new terms, she whispered. His fingers brushed her cheek. Name them. Honesty, she said. In public and in private. Yes. No separate lives performed for convenience. Yes. And the South Mill, she added softly. We restore it together. A quiet smile touched his mouth. Agreed. He kissed her then. Not tentative, not cautious, but with the steady certainty of a man who had finally chosen. The following week, a box arrived from Mr. Whitaker. Juliet had written to ask whether her grandfather had left any correspondence regarding the Whitmore family. The box was small and plain. Dark wood. Brass latch. Alexander sat beside her on the library floor as she opened it. Inside lay letters bound with faded ribbon. The handwriting on the first envelope was unmistakable. Colonel Henry Callahan, addressed to Robert Whitmore, Alexander's father. Juliet untied the ribbon carefully. The letters told a story neither of them had known in full. 30 years earlier, the Colonel and Robert Whitmore had been close friends. They had invested together in a railroad expansion across Pennsylvania, a venture promising growth and shared prosperity. When political shifts and a collapsed bridge project destroyed the investment, panic had spread through the partners. The Colonel had withdrawn his capital first. He had protected Callahan House. He had left Robert Whitmore exposed to the loss. But the letters that followed were not filled with anger. They were filled with quiet hurt. Robert's writing spoke of confusion, of trust misplaced. The Colonel's responses carried regret. Drafts unsent, apologies written, but never delivered. One final letter, dated 6 months before the Colonel's death, was addressed to no one. I failed him when I chose fear over loyalty. I have carried that knowledge longer than I have carried any medal from war. I cannot undo it. But perhaps our children can choose differently. I place my trust in Juliet. She is braver than I was. Juliet's vision blurred as she finished reading. Alexander sat very still beside her. He knew, she whispered. He knew what he had done. Alexander's jaw tightened. My father believed he never admitted it. He did, she said softly. Only too late. The fire crackled gently in the hearth. Alexander leaned back against the chair behind him and closed his eyes. Oh, he should have told him while he lived, he said. Yes. She did not excuse her grandfather. She did not soften the truth. He was afraid, she said, and pride kept him silent. Alexander opened his eyes and looked at her. And now? Now, she said carefully, we decide whether pride continues. He studied her face for a long moment. Then he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was small, tender. My father would have liked you, he said quietly. She felt tears threaten, but did not let them fall. I think your father would have liked that you chose differently. Winter deepened. Snow covered the South Mill in white silence. Yet plans were drawn. Engineers were hired. Juliet and Alexander walked the frozen fields together, boots crunching in frost. Drainage would be repaired in spring. The mill wheel rebuilt. The land reclaimed. It would cost money. It would require effort. But it would require trust. They did it anyway. By March, the thaw began. The river swelled with melting ice. The earth softened beneath careful hands. Juliet rode beside Alexander across the estate one bright afternoon, her skirts gathered neatly, her posture steady. You were right about the land, he said as they approached the mill. It was waiting, she replied. So were we, he answered quietly. The work continued through April. By May, the south field was planted. Its Barrett walked the rows each morning with satisfaction in his eyes. Ashford Manor felt different in spring. Windows were opened. Fresh air carried the scent of damp earth and budding roses. The staff moved more lightly through the halls. Juliet's mother visited in June. She watched Alexander carefully at first, as though measuring the man who had once seemed cold. She left 2 weeks later with quiet approval. He looks at you, she said before departing. As though you were something he nearly lost. Juliet smiled. He almost did, she replied. Summer arrived in full warmth. One evening in July, they sat in the garden behind the manor. Lanterns glowed softly. The air was sweet with blooming roses. Alexander held a book, but was not reading. Juliet watched the sky shift from gold to deep blue. You are thinking about him, Alexander said gently. Yes. Your grandfather. Yes. He closed the book. He would have been insufferable about the mill, Alexander added. She laughed softly. He would have claimed foresight. He would have written letters about it for years. She leaned into him. I think he would have been proud, she said. So do I. The hawks circled high above the fields that summer. The South Mill turned once more by August, its wheel catching sunlight as water rushed beneath it. The tenants prospered. Ashford Manor no longer felt divided into wings. There was no longer east and west. There was only home. On the anniversary of the reading of the will, Juliet stood once more at the library window. The river moved quietly below. Alexander came to stand behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "The will?" "Yes." She turned in his arms. 30 days, she said, were never the point. What was? Choice. He studied her. And if the will had never demanded it? She smiled. Then we might have spent a lifetime pretending not to see each other. He brushed his thumb along her cheek. "I was afraid," he admitted. "I know. You were never someone who did not belong," he continued. "You were simply someone I did not yet have the courage to stand beside." She rested her forehead against his. "You stand beside me now?" "Yes." Outside, the mill wheel turned steadily. The land flourished. Old wounds had not vanished, but they had been faced, named, chosen against. 30 days had begun as a condition. They had become a beginning. And in the quiet strength of Ashford Manor, beneath wide American skies, the Duke who once looked at her with dismissal now looked at her as though she were the best decision he had ever made.